Selection of the canon. I actually heard this very thing from a friend of mine from middle school and high school, so that was many years ago, but I heard her make this comment just several years ago, which is basically, why should we trust the Bible? Wasn't the contents of the Bible arbitrarily decided upon by a bunch of obscure bishops at some church council in 325 AD? And I am surprised at how many people have basically that same view that, okay, so a bunch of dead white guys, and actually they weren't white, but a bunch of dead white guys all got together in 325 and decided what the Bible was going to be for the rest of it. So that seems to be the viewpoint of a lot of people. And there's two things wrong with that viewpoint. First off, it was not the Council of Nicaea in 325. That's the first thing. The second thing is, it wasn't arbitrarily decided upon. All they did was affirm the books that had been used for almost 300 years, that had been in wide use all throughout Christendom. So it's not like they arbitrarily said, well, you know, my nephew Biff wrote this nice little thing, you know, in his middle school class, and I think we should include it because, you know, it's my nephew Biff. Well, that's not how it worked. The nephew Biff's writing would have been rejected because it was not written by somebody who knew Jesus or knew somebody who knew Jesus. So there were some criteria that were probably applied during the selection process. And here's what they might be. So it was not willy-nilly, it was not arbitrary. Here's what the possible criteria for inclusion, we're talking about the New Testament here. We're not really talking about the Old Testament. We can talk about the Old Testament, but that's not the problem. It had to be ancient authorship. So as much as everybody liked Origen or Tertullian or Clement of Alexandria or Eusebius, none of their writings would have been included because they weren't ancient authorship. By people that personally knew Jesus or were recording the words of people who knew Jesus. I realize Luke probably didn't personally know Jesus, but by tradition he was recording the words of people who did know. That have been in common use and common acceptance within the church since the time of the earliest of the early church fathers. Now, there was probably a little horse trading that went on. Some books were more popular in the Eastern Church than they were in the Western Church. And you had Constantinople versus Rome, and there was probably some horse trading. If it had been entirely up to the Roman Church, I don't think Hebrews would have made it. If it had been entirely up to Constantinople, I don't think Revelation would have made it, as horrifying a thought as that is. So there was some compromise between the two. But still, same thing, ancient, written by people who knew Jesus or were recording the words of someone who knew Jesus. And it's as important if we look at these criteria, what they did not allow into the New Testament. If you take those criteria, that meant all those works, they would have been out. Because they weren't of ancient authorship, and more importantly, they weren't written by people who actually knew Jesus or were recording the words of people who knew Jesus. So things like the Gospel of Thomas and the secret dialogue of the Savior and all that stuff, the Gospel of Mary, all those would have been precluded. They wouldn't even have been considered. This leaves out the early church fathers. Even the earliest of the early church fathers, even a guy like Clement of Rome, or probably more importantly, how about Barnabas? There's a perfectly nice, perfectly reasonable letter called the Letter of Barnabas that dates back to the first century, and it was not included in the canon. Why was it not included in the canon? Barnabas never met Jesus. So even an apostle, a prominent apostle, a crony, an FOP, a friend of Paul, Even a guy like that who writes this wonderful letter, who explains what baptism's all about in a Christian context, probably the first time anybody had ever sat down to write out exactly what it means. And it was rejected because he didn't personally know Jesus. And the same thing, as I said, Clement of Rome.
Reaffirming it's not what you know, it's who you know.
It's true. Silas would be another. If Silas had written a gospel, or Silas had written a letter, it wouldn't be included because Silas never met Jesus. So this precluded certain types of works, and some of them are ones that we might be sympathetic to include. I think a lot of people in here, if it was up to us, and we were redefining the New Testament, we might be sympathetic to the case of Barnabas, but they did not include Barnabas.
That's why you had the Apocrypha for.
Pardon?
That's why we had the Apocrypha for.
Yeah, although the Apocrypha is not New Testament, it's Old Testament.
Intertestament.
So, how did we get our canon as we know it today? It basically came from two people as the leaders, if you will. One is Eusebius, or Eusebius, if you're British, and the other is Athanasius. So Eusebius, you can see when he lived, 260 to 340. So he was right there at the time of the Council of Nicaea. He's the bishop of Caesarea, and this is a Caesarea that's on the coast of Israel. He was friends with the Emperor Constantine, and when Constantine took over the whole Roman Empire, united the east and western parts for the first time in a number of years. He asked his buddy Bishop Eusebius, he asked him to write a history of the church. Because Constantine had basically by that point become a Christian. He hadn't been baptized yet, but he'd become a Christian. And he wanted to learn more about the church, so he asked Eusebius to write this history of the church. And Eusebius wrote the very first history of the Christian church, and since it was the very first, he got to call it church history, or ecclesiastical history, because it was the first. So in that wonderful book that he wrote, he had a list of accepted and rejected and spurious books. And his list of accepted books of the New Testament is basically the same as our modern New Testament, with a few exceptions. James isn't there, Jude, Hebrews, 2 Peter, 2 John, and 3 John. So I always ask this question at this point, how many of you would have your faith shaken if any of those books were missing from the New Testament? Do you consider any of those books essential to salvation? Do any of you go home and gather your family around a fireplace with you on a winter's evening and take turns reading from 3 John? Lance, you ever do that?
Pretty short evening.
You say, let us read from the 3rd letter of John.
Yeah, short, sit before the fire.
Yeah.
Where'd that go?
Your children might vote for that because it's a very short. Revelation, interestingly enough, was on both his list of accepted books and his disputed rejected list. And this means he was playing a bit of the politician, because if the book was popular in the West, but it was not popular in the East, so he just put it on both lists.
Today's equivalent of voting president.
A voting president, there you go. Basically, he wasn't going to take a position, and people could decide.
He voted for it before he voted against it.
There you go.
The flopper.
So here is Eusebius on his accepted books. He said, since we are dealing with this subject, it is proper to sum up the right. Except, before we do this, you got to remember, no one had ever done this before. This is the first guy who thought, well, you know, if we were going to put together a New Testament, what should be it? And he wouldn't have done it if it hadn't been for the fact that Constantine said, you know, you really should settle all this stuff. Yeah. Since we are dealing with this subject, it is proper to sum up the writings of the New Testament, which have been already mentioned. First, we must put the holy quaternion of the gospel. I love that word. That's not a word we use much today. the quaternion, the four Gospels. Following them, Acts of the Apostles. After this must be reckoned the epistles of Paul. Next in order, the extant former epistle of John, so that's John 1. And likewise the epistle of Peter, or 1 Peter, must be maintained. After them is to be placed, if it really seem proper, the Apocalypse of John, concerning which we shall give the different opinions at the proper time. These belong among the accepted writings. So this is the first person who's ever done this, and he did do it in 325. So that's why the people who say, well, did a bunch of old dead white guys get together in 325 and decide the Bible for the rest of it? Well, actually they didn't, because you see the stuff that's missing from his list. Is it missing from our Bible today? No. So it was not decided on in 325. But this was the first attempt by a well-known bishop to kind of, well, you know, what book should be included. There's another one I should mention that I guess I didn't include in the book. Another thing that Constantine asked Eusebius to do, and this really put him on the spot. Constantine asked them to produce 50 first-rate Bibles, finest vellum, with gold leaf, and cost was no consideration. Constantine would fund
It's good to be king.
and he put Eusebius in charge of producing these 50 magnificent Bibles. Well, there's a problem. Old Testament, the Jews have decided what was in the Old Testament at the Council of Jamnia back in the 1st century, so he just used that list. No problem there. But what do you put in the New Testament? That means that on orders from the emperor, Eusebius had to decide which books to include in these 50 magnificent Bibles. And so it's possible that our New Testament as we know it today was actually set at that time. But we don't know for sure because probably none of those Bibles exist anymore. Now, in the last 25 years, there have been some finds of very old Bibles. The Sinaiticus, and what's the other one? The Codex Sinaiticus, and if Byron was here, he would know what the other one was. But they're very old Bibles dating back to the 1st century. Some people think that one of these might be one of those 50 Bibles, but we don't know that for sure. So Eusebius may have been forced into producing a New Testament that had all those books in it because the emperor had ordered it. But let's move to Athanasius, who is really the person who fixes the canon as we know it today. Bishop of Alexandria for 45 years. In 367, he writes his Easter newsletter. 39th letter of the Holy Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria, on the Easter festival, the Paschal festival. And he wrote this wonderful newsletter, and in amongst the the church services on Easter, we're going to have 3 services, and they're going to be this time, and the greeters will be so-and-so, and the deacons taking the offering will be so-and-so.
The church picnic will be.
The church picnic will be at such and such a time. There's going to be some baptism. In amongst that, he said, it seemed good to me also, having been urged thereto by true brethren, and having learned from the beginning, to set before you the books included in the canon, and handed down in the canon of the wine, to the end that anyone who is fallen into error may condemn those who have led him astray, and that he who has committed steadfast in purity, or continued steadfast in purity, may again rejoice, having these things brought to his remembrance. So this is in 367. So this is, what, how many years? So it's about 42 years after Eusebius had come up with his list of accepted and disputed books. This is finally when we get the canon we have today. And here it is. So after the notice for the church picnic, it says, again, it is not tedious to speak of the books of the New Testament. These are the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Acts of the Apostles, and the universal epistles, 7, of James 1, of Peter 2, of John 3, after these one of Jude. In addition, there are 14 letters of Paul, written in this order. He talks about Romans, 2 to the Corinthians, the Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 2 to the Thessalonians, the Hebrews, 2 to Timothy, 1 to Titus, and lastly, back to Philemon. And besides, the Revelation of John. These are the fountains of salvation, that they who thirst may be satisfied with the living words they contain. And these alone is proclaim the doctrine of godliness. Let no man add to these, neither let him take aught from these. So there you have that. If anyone adds anything or anyone takes away, you're in trouble. We finally decided this. So it's kind of amazing to a lot of people that it took 300 years after most of the books of the New Testament were written before the church finally got around to deciding which books to include in the New Testament. But even Athanasius, he didn't do this just, oh, let's see, what book should I include? Because it's what I think that matters. That's not what happened. There's a set of books that have been in use since the time of the apostles. Now, it wasn't like today where we have our New Testament, and on Sunday morning we can read from any of the 4 Gospels, we can read from any of the letters of Paul, etc. That's not how it was, at least not for the first couple hundred years after the apostles. If Paul sent a letter to the Ephesians or Paul sent a letter to Corinth, well then that would be a treasured letter that would probably be read in church every Sunday. Some churches might have had the Gospel of John, other churches might have had the Gospel of Matthew. For the first couple hundred years, it was probably pretty rare that anybody would have all of the books that later became our New Testament. Probably the Pope did, or probably the Bishop of Rome, I should say, did. They probably did in Constantinople after Constantine took over. But your average parish church out in the boondocks, Marsdale Presbyterian Church, would not have had copies of all these books. Now, we get into the 4th century, as Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire, well, then it makes sense that with the emperor of the Roman Empire saying, we really should make these available to everyone, that A, you're going to have to decide what those books are, and B, you're going to have to start copying them and distributing them. But prior to Constantine, it would have been very unusual for your average congregation to have all these books that make up the New Testament. So what Eusebius and what Athanasius did is they looked at the books that were in common use. And because they were such prominent people, Patriarch of Constantinople, Patriarch of Alexandria, or Bishop of Severia, these were very important positions. And because they were such important positions, they knew all these different books that were being used throughout Christendom. And they said, well, I know we have Gospel Matthew, is used over here, Gospel Mark. And they were aware of all these, and because they had been in constant use since the very earliest days of the church, because they had been written by people who actually knew Jesus or were recording the words of people who had known Jesus, because of that, they were able to come up with this list. I think it's a reasonable list. We could quibble about poor Barnabas, why he didn't make it. We could quibble about the shepherd of Hermas. Maybe that should have made it. But all in all, I think it's a pretty good list. And if your faith is going to be shaken by the inclusion or lack of inclusion by 2nd and 3rd John, then I would suggest you go back and read Romans and the Gospel of John and reassess your position. So it was not decided arbitrarily. It was not decided by a bunch of dead white guys who got together in a room. It was decided because over 300 years there were a set of books that have been used dating back to the earliest days of the church. And some criteria was applied to choosing them, and I think it was probably reasonable criteria.